Hello, welcome to this presentation on the basics of term bases. A term base is a terminology database file that is used within computer-assisted translation and terminology software applications. Term-base exchange, or TBX for short, is the underlying file format of computer-assisted translation compatible term bases. The amount of data points collected about concepts in various languages quickly becomes unmanageable when using simple glossaries and spreadsheets. TBX and term bases make the collection of terminological data manageable. Not only that, TBX and term bases allow terminological data to be applied by machines like CAT tools and generative AI systems. To understand best practices in term-based design, you first need to understand the difference between lexicography and terminography. Lexicography is the work done to produce dictionaries. So in lexicography, all possible meanings for a word are collected into a word entry. Conversely, terminography starts with the meaning. A single concept or meaning is recorded in a terminological record, and all possible labels that denote that concept are collected into that record. Have a look at the illustration of the differences between lexicography and terminology from the World Intellectual Property Organization that is on screen now. This illustration shows a lexicographical entry for the word joint, which would collect all possible meanings for the word joint from a wide variety of subject fields. And on the other hand, the multiple terminological entries that would be created to denote each of the concepts designated with the word joint. Next, it's important to understand the hierarchical structure of term bases and the hierarchical relations among the data collected on terminology in term bases. Term bases, whether in Trados multi-term or MemoQ, arrange terminological data according to the entry level, the language level, and the term level. This hierarchical structure reflects the purpose of terminology work. So in dictionary work, lexicography, all possible meanings for a word are collected into an entry. In terminology work, or terminography, all designations for a single concept, including the head term and any synonyms like abbreviations or spelling variations for that concept, are collected into just one concept entry. This prevents synonyms used in source content from being interpreted as unique concepts when they are in fact another way of referring to a concept that has already been designated with another term within the literature. Within this hierarchical structure, the principle of inheritance applies. So that is, the characteristics collected at the broader levels of the term base, at the higher levels of the term base, are passed down to the more detailed levels. So there's an example on screen here of a concept entry within Trados multi-term for the concept of localization. Notice that the English synonyms localization, L10N, and loc are collected into the same concept entry, since all of these designations designate the exact same concept. The types of information collected at the entry level, the language level, and the term level of the concept entries in term bases is as follows. So the entry level, or the concept level, is where information that applies to an entire terminological entry is collected. The most important information collected at this level is the subject field. Without the subject field, terminology doesn't have meaning, and users may confuse the homonym pruning to mean the activity of removing branches, buds, or roots from a plant, rather than the activity of streamlining the guidelines for decision-making presented in a decision tree, just for example. Including the subject field for each entry of a glossary or term base is a best practice of terminology management. It's one of the most important things you can do in your term bases is include the subject field at the entry level. You'll notice that in the example pictured on screen here, this is an entry from the LocTerms project. The LocTerms project is a project that collects terminology related to translation and localization. So the subject field is already indicated just in the name of the project. So instead of collecting the subject field, we're collecting a subfield at the entry level. And our subfields include things like general translation and localization terminology, or concepts, I should say, technology management, language proficiency, theory, etc. The subject matter is collected at the entry level because it applies to all of the other information collected in the entry. That is, the information collected about the term at the language level will also be within the same subject field. The information collected at the term level will also be in the same subject field. So rather than in our terminology entry for a concept, rather than putting the subject field at every single level of the term base, we put it at the entry level because it applies to everything else in the entry through the principle of inheritance. At the language level, we collect information that applies to all of the terms for a concept in a single language. The most important information to collect at the language level is the definition. The language level is where the definition is collected rather than the term level, because no matter the term used, it's going to have the same definition. Localization, L10, N, and loc, they all mean the same thing. So it would be silly to put the definition for the terms at the term level. We put it at the language level. We don't put the definition, or at least it's not recommended to put the definition at the concept level, although that is sometimes done for a number of reasons. First of all, it just isn't logical, right? If you have a definition written in English, obviously that's not the definition for the terms that are collected for the concept in Spanish. On the other hand, this has much more political implications too, because if we're putting, for example, an English definition, understanding that English is a lingua franca at the concept level, we're essentially saying that the English conceptual structures for thinking about knowledge apply to every language. We're not giving each language a chance to define its own conceptual structures. And so keeping the definition at the language level is another best practice, where you can also note slight differences between concepts so that your translators, when translating, can navigate those issues. So they're not just assuming that this designation means the exact same thing, or this concept means the exact same thing in every language. Sometimes there won't be true 100% equivalencies. In fact, one could argue that there would never be true 100% equivalencies, but we would want to be noting that and having each language be defined using its language. Standards of best practice currently indicate that including definitions in concept entries within term bases is a best practice of terminology management. And there's special rules for writing definitions, such as not using the term that has been defined in the definition, that's called a circular definition, or not using negation in a definition, so not saying what something is not, saying what something is. However, best practices also indicate that definitions should be written and approved by SMEs. So there's recognition in the field that definition writing is not economical for many terminology projects and terminology resources, or the creation of many terminology resources. And those best practices are according to ISO 704 terminology best practices. When providing definitions is outside of the scope for the development of a terminology resource, a really good alternative is to provide some sort of context that contains both the term and a general meaning for that term. So when contexts are used instead of definitions, the context is included at the term level and not the language level, because the context may not necessarily include the head terms and all synonyms. So you just want the context to go with the specific term that is the specific spelling variation of the term that is being contextualized. At the term level, information about each term is collected. Head terms and synonyms are collected into their own term blocks, because we'll collect different types of information about, or the information we'll collect will be the same, but some of the responses we give to the information collected will be different. For example, you can see that in the example pictured on screen that localization is designated as the head term and L10.0 is designated as a synonym. This is to tell translators and writers that, hey, our preferred form when writing formally is going to be localization. You can see that the term L10N is indicated to be an abbreviated form, that the term loc is indicated to be something that's used colloquially in speech. So if there were an instance where I'm thinking, hey, I want to use an abbreviation in my writing because I'd like that variation of, rather than typing localization, I'd like to have an abbreviation that will make the communication more specific. If I know that loc is used colloquially in speech, I'm not going to use that in writing. I'm going to use the L10N. So the information we're collecting at the term level is term specific. When collecting true terminology in a term base, and so when I say true terminology, I'm talking about specialized terminology rather than organizational jargon like branding, or even elements of writing like headers that people would like to keep consistent. Sometimes people use term bases to keep other elements of writing consistent as well. But when collecting true terminology in a term base, all terms included should be written in lowercase unless they are legitimately proper nouns, and in singular form, except in special instances. This is because if you start a term that is not a proper noun in your term base with an uppercase letter, which many of us are in the habit of doing, right? The autocorrect of most computer systems, if we don't start a word that starts a line with a capital letter, the autocorrect will fix it. But in a term base, we want to keep terms that are not proper nouns lowercase, because it causes confusion if there's a capital letter at the start of a term that isn't a proper noun. Translators and writers are suddenly going to start wondering, should I be using an uppercase every single time? Is this like some rule that the company or organization has that I should be following? On the other hand, if they know somebody just made a mistake in their term base and capitalized things where they shouldn't, when they go to do an automatic quality control check within a CAT tool or content authoring environment, what will happen is, if the term doesn't match the uppercase letter used in the term base in the actual literature, in the actual writing, that's going to trigger all sorts of false positive, hey, you didn't match the term base notifications that will be really annoying to work through. So unless the terminology is a proper noun, keep it lowercase. At the term level, you can include information like term descriptions, usage, the status for each of the terms collected, and multi-term and other terminology applications, or applications with a terminology module like SmartCat, give a lot of flexibility for what data points are collected for a term and how that data is organized. On the other hand, when looking at how computer-assisted translation and terminology systems model data, some are much more closed in their models. They've got a model for what they are going to include at the entry language and term level that is fixed, that you cannot change, in which case you'll need to figure out how to if you're collecting other types of information, how to make the types of information collected compatible. So Termbase exchange is the underlying file format of compatible term bases, but the TBX file extension is often altered by cat tool creators for the purposes of branding. So this is just an example of a multi-term term base that has the primary file extension of .sdltb. All right, that concludes this presentation on the basics of term bases.